Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Ristenpart. I'm a professor of chemical engineering, and I'm the director of the UC Davis Coffee Center. And it is my great honor and privilege today to introduce our guest, Jerry Baldwin. Jerry is the co-founder of Starbucks, president emeritus of Peet's Coffee, and he has a long bio here. He asked me to keep it short, and so I'll keep it short. He studied English at the University of San Francisco and then founded Starbucks. And then he's had a very long career in coffee. He was the director of the Association Scientifique Internationale de Café. He's a trustee and chairman of the Coffee Quality Institute. He's basically a legend in the coffee industry. And so we're very honored to have Jerry here today. And can we just welcome him? Let's give a yeah. And so I have a whole bunch of questions here that I'm going to ask Jerry.
What a surprise.
Yes, what a surprise. And what I'd like to do is ask a bunch of questions and then open it up at the end for student questions as well. So are you ready? That's the first question. You ready? Okay, here we go. So
let's go.
So first I'd like to kind of reflect on the past here a bit. And so as you look around and see the students here, many of them are in their 20s, and most students here on campus never experienced a campus where it was impossible to walk into a Peet's Coffee and get, a cappuccino or a latte. So when you started Starbucks, okay, what was it like? Like, what was the coffee culture like before Starbucks? What was it like back then?
Well, in college in San Francisco, there were many coffee houses, especially from North Beach, but also in our neighborhood. The one I liked, which is just down the street, the Blue Unicorn. It was next door to the laundromat, so I could do my laundry and go next door. If the friend was there, we could play chess. There were no cell phones to look at, no laptops. You could read, and the coffee was wretched, but that yet another story. But by the time that we started in Seattle, you asked about starting, there was Peet's had been founded in 1966. We were getting started in 1971. So there was the beginning of the specialty coffee, at least in the Bay Area. There were a few sprinkling of other companies elsewhere. In New York, there were some leftovers from the 30s, just a few, where you could buy coffee beans.
And so when you walked into one of those early Starbucks or Peet's, could you get a latte?
No, I'm thinking about Alfred Peet. Anyway, no, you could get a cup of, well, first of all, almost our entire business was coffee beans for you to take home and brew yourselves. And we did serve coffee. It was a very small part of the business at that time. You could have either French roast or the coffee of the moment. You could put half and half or sugar in it. That's it. Take it or leave it. So the rest of it has evolved over time.
And so you mentioned Alfred H. Peet. He's the founder of Peet's Coffee. What was it like working with him?
Well, Alfred was, quite an unusual guy. I mean, first of all, he claimed that his coffee apprenticeship started by crawling inside his father's roaster to clean it when he was about 10 years old. And he didn't have a very good relationship with his father, but then he was captured by the Germans at the beginning of World War II. He became a machinist. But in his telling, well, and I believe this to be accurate. No, it is accurate. I've seen documentation. Is he was kind of a troublemaker. So the Germans took him out of the Dutch group and put him in the French group, thinking that because he didn't speak the language, it wouldn't cause any trouble. But when the French went on, you got to go home on leave, believe it or not, if you even as a captive. He just disappeared into France, made it back to Holland, and didn't go back to work and managed to survive. But then at the end of the war, he took tea training in London and went to Indonesia So he was, quite knowledgeable about many things coffee, but he was also culturally smart, good sense of humor, good cook, good palate. And so all of that was fun to work with. And he agreed to help us. So generous guy.
So, so something that, touching on that, we teach in our design of coffee class, and I see several people here from Design of Coffee. We talk about the importance of Maillard reactions in coffee. And so, for those of you who don't know, that's where the sugars in coffee react with proteins to make yummy brown molecules called melanoidins. Okay, so I'm a chemical engineer, so I got to slip in some chemistry. And so I'm really curious. Clearly, Alfred Peet had a lot of experience with coffee, but how often did you use phrases like Maillard reactions? Did you talk about the science, or was it more of an art?
All the time.
Yeah?
No, never.
No, okay.
But obviously we talked about roast and its effect, but talking today about Maillard reaction, especially the proliferation of roasts. I mean, now you go into a coffee store and you're not if you don't know the place, you don't know whether you're going to get something that's lightly roasted or almost roasted or fully roasted. So I just made a pitch for a Maillard reaction. Let's develop some flavor, okay? Coffee flavor, which would require a little roasting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So besides Alfred Peet, did you have other mentors who helped you how did you get trained into the world of coffee, besides Alfred?
Well, I mean, as we were talking earlier, in all of those days, learning about coffee was experiential. That it was a traditional trade handed down by word of mouth, a few books, but nothing like the design for coffee that, I don't know how many 10,000 students have taken.
A lot.
Yeah. And so developing knowledge was, one needed mentors like Alfred Peet, or I was adopted sort of by a guy who had a commercial coffee company in Seattle. Davies was the coffee. Ernesto Ely, later on I was in 10 years and met him. The chemist who was trapped in the coffee business, as I thought about it, and so he was having fun. And he was a great source of scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So, as a student, then how many university-level courses about coffee did you take?
Oh, boy. Well, specifically, of course, none. Mm-hmm. But, there was physics and chemistry, and none of which were directly applied to coffee. Mm-hmm. And I'm not aware of any American course on coffee, including growing at that point. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we're trying to change here at Davis. So, as I mentioned, you majored in English at University of San Francisco. So I think this is a question that I think a lot of my colleagues in the English department and students majoring in English would love to hear. How did your English major prepare you to become a founder and CEO of major companies?
Well, I don't know if I can connect both ends of that, but I will say that English language is, is it the foundation of ideas? Maybe. But it's without, maybe a better example is when I bought a vineyard, the first thing I did was I took viticulture. And the reason was I wasn't expecting to work in the vineyard really, but I did want to learn the nomenclature. So when I was talking to someone who was operating in my vineyard, I would have some clue about what he or she was talking about. And I think that, the first thing that a writer is told, or among the first things, is show, don't tell. And so that showing experiential is, I think, more valuable. And what do you do if you're taking speech? Engage with the audience so that you find some rapport. So I think those soft skills were valuable. Look into the customer's eye and tell them how good this coffee is. But I think you can be in coffee from any discipline. I mean, if you, right? All of you taking the design for coffee class, you're not all registered in engineering, I assume.
Very few. So that's kind of my next question is like, do you think, so that was in 1971, now we're in 2024, and I think you just kind of answered, but like, do you think there's an important role for humanities majors in coffee? And I think you just said that, but like.
Well, I think there's an important role for humanities majors everywhere, and every time I read one of those articles, it said they're disappearing or they're folded into wherever. One of the, well, I mean, historically sociology majors, that coffee, you think about the cultural history of coffee, is that people go into coffee houses to talk, not to just get a cup of coffee. But, penny universities closed because of sedition and, causing, how those students are when they're having coffee, they just, you don't know what they're going to come up with.
It's risky business. And so, like you mentioned, the kind of experiential, and I guess this. Let me break in, just put in a plug. The new coffee center has lots of cool roasters, and we emphasize experiential stuff. And so, English majors, all majors are welcome at the coffee center. But let's change gears though. Like so we talked about Alpha Peet and like how you kind of got into it. I think many modern coffee companies, including Peet's, really strive for quality. They talk about quality all day long. And in our email exchanges, you said something that really struck me. You said that quality is free. Quality is free. So could you explain that? What do you mean by that? What is quality?
Actually, I want to back up a little bit. Okay. My partner, Gordon Bowker, who was my college roommate, among other things, but also a gifted writer, and a gifted observer of the zeitgeist at various times, pointed out that all coffee companies claim freshness and quality. So, what company, when you say, well, our mission statement is to buy mediocre coffee, roast it and keep it until it's stale, and then sell it to people for a lot of money. Well, no one, of course. No, we have the best, man. So speaking of show don't tell, his idea was, let's not say it, let's just do it. And that's what we did. So anyway, there's a second part to your question.
Quality is free. Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, Quality is Free was the title of a book by a man named Philip Crosby. And it struck me that quality is just effort. Or in the memorable words to me of Robert Rauschenberg, the artist, my art comes from just paying attention. So if you're looking or cupping, how does it taste? I mean, we'll get to that one later. But the idea of quality is free is simply to pay attention to. Well, pay attention to so many details. I mean, I've got another project for you, actually, and that is the length of time from the end of the roast until the package is sealed is pretty important. I can tell you from tasting, so you can add that one to the list.
Are you guys taking notes? Okay, good.
And just paying attention to the roast. Why is the roaster going so fast today? Well, in that case that I'm thinking about, it was because it was windy, and the wind was accelerating the flow of air through the roaster, and so on. So just getting people who were not as connected to it as I was to pay attention to what they were drinking, how they were brewing. When we got into the restaurant business, I recall a conversation on the phone with someone in a restaurant account saying, I don't know what's the matter. The water's just shooting through the brewer. So I started asking questions, and he wants me to come and fix it. But it turned out that for a whole shift, no one had discovered that the spray head had been removed for cleaning, but not reinserted. So the way you brew coffee in a commercial brewer is to spray it over all the coffee. Never mind that, man, you know.
So it was just coming down as a stream.
Just pay attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I've read several places that you describe yourself as a coffee man, not as a businessman, which might seem weird for a CEO, you know. And so, what do you mean by that? And I think, maybe the audience is getting a sense.
Yeah.
But, like, what do you mean by you're a coffee man, not a businessman?
Well, I can tell you that it has seemed weird to unnamed professor of, I guess, entrepreneurship, who was, I didn't say it in exactly that way, but he said, well, why didn't you just want to build a huge company? It frankly, never occurred to me. Well, I think that what happened to people of the first generation, Alfred Peet, George Howell in Boston, myself in Seattle, even Herb Hyman in Los Angeles with Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf, is that while we're interested in having dynamic, small d dynamic company where people were interested to work and interested in the product, we didn't conceive of a large company. There were no large coffee companies except in Europe. Alfred Peet and I had a conversation. There was there were a couple of chains at that time, Chibo and Dusho. And Chibo had about 700 of its own stores in Germany and about 5,000 bakeries and specialty stores where you could buy their beans. And I mean, I have to chuckle. Alfred said, well, we should do this. We should join forces before I own the company and do it. And you know, the conversation didn't go very far before we both just had another glass of wine and forgot about it. But it, you know, later on, the next generation, let's say Howard Schultz, to whom I sold Starbucks, and many others that followed, is that that was a sort of an 80s idea, is build big companies. Venture capital now is going, if you can, in the early 70s, there were 4 universities in the United States that had courses in entrepreneurship. 4. I used to be able to name them. I can't do it now, but and they're in strange locations. Texas and Michigan were 2 of the 4. But, so it wasn't so unusual, but what we're interested in is the coffee. And when Gordon, Zev, and I started Starbucks, we were really thinking about opening a coffee store, not starting a coffee company. And we opened one. Hey, this worked. Let's open another one. That one worked too. I guess we have a company now. We better. And when Zev sold 10 years later in 1980, and Gordon never, up to that point, had not worked in the company. So then that's when I started to think of myself as the president. I need to figure out what to do next. So then, but I still didn't think about huge growth. I just wanted to keep everybody interested. You know, I recall once saying after owning Peet's that, you know, if we just keep opening a store a year by, I don't know, whatever date it was, we might have 50. Might get all the way to Sacramento.
They went a little further. Yeah. And so that's fascinating about the entrepreneurship and the training for that. What other, what were some of the other biggest changes you've seen in the coffee industry from that time period to now?
Wow. Well, what was interesting at the beginning is that basically all I had to do was open the doors, because at that time, you know, in the 60s, we're starting to get the generation of young people whose parents had fought World War II. And now they're interested in travel. Gordon and Zev both. Took a year off and went to Europe, which was common enough. And but you had to take a boat because there were no jets at the time. And excuse me, I have this residual cold that continues. But so when we began, as I say, I'm sorry, I lost the thread here. As I'm
What's the biggest changes in you're loading?
Changing, yeah, okay. So, but people would come in and say, "Oh, this coffee is great. I'll buy some." It was really expensive. It was double the cost of supermarket. It cost $1.25 a pound. And it was so expensive that some people bought our coffee and mixed it half and half with, I don't know, Folgers or whatever, because it was just too expensive to drink all on its own. But I think what was fortunate for us is that in a way we were selling to ourselves, selling to our own generation, people who were interested in food, interested in travel, and it just kept going. We used to joke that in Berkeley, after Peet's, if we opened a store, Jim Reynolds is my colleague at Peet's. He was the roaster who followed me at Starbucks, and we are still employed at Peet's. We used to joke that we could open a store in his garage in Berkeley and people would find it in about a week. And we didn't try it, but it was pretty easy then.
Okay, so I mentioned the logo is up on that billboard over there, but you're also on the board of something called TechnoServe, which I think many of our students probably not very familiar with. Can you describe TechnoServe and like what its mission is and what your role is?
Yeah, maybe I'll come back to that. Let me stay on change for a while.
Okay.
That the beverage business was tiny. At Starbucks, we just gave coffee away. It was in a cup about half the size. And we found it was really effective. It was porcelain that it was from porcelain from Brazil too. Is that when they have a porcelain a cup of coffee in their hand, it'd be impolite to plunk it down and just leave. So they would be sipping it, and so many times, of course, we were just evangelists, Here, try this coffee, take a sip, and they say, man, that is strong. We made it full strength, 60 grams a liter, and in a vacuum pot. Have one of those, recommended by Alfred Peet. And then you get to talk to them the whole time because they have this thing in there. They're attached to our cup. I mean, that wasn't deliberate. I mean, this is the way it came. We weren't that smart. So by the third sip, the first sip is, whoa, that's strong. The third sip was, hey, this is pretty good. Half the cup, you have a new customer. It worked, it worked really well. So, but anyway, we're selling beans. That was about 2/3 of the business. Accessories you couldn't buy anywhere else. European brewers, cone brewers, press pots. There was no place to buy them, so we sold them. Peet's did. We did as well. Of course, there was no Costco then. Williams-Sonoma had started, but it started in Sonoma in 1956. And I think it had, 2 stores by the time we were going. So the changes are huge. And now, since the pandemic particularly, when people started brewing at home, and the bean business moved gradually from specialty shops to supermarkets, now to clubs, Costco, and then during the pandemic to Amazon and Target and all the rest of them. I mean, you have to go to a store to buy coffee? No. Let me just go online. And now a coffee store is really a coffee bar that you all know where you can get all kinds of drinks that Italians never associated with an espresso machine.
So that's fascinating to me. Like early Starbucks, you would go in and be handed a ceramic mug.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't happen anymore. Yeah.
No.
But those must be collector items, right? Like,
Well, and Albert Peet had done the same with a very fancy mug, although he charged for his coffee. But he complained that he had outfitted every student kitchen in Berkeley. So he switched to disposable cups. So,
So I'm sure none of our students take anything from the DCs. Right?
Well, and actually circling back to the economics majors, in 1973 there was a very severe frost in Brazil, and the price of green coffee really went high, and we had to keep raising our prices. And when it hit $2 a pound retail, we thought we were toast. It worked out okay, But at that point, it became so expensive for us that we stopped serving coffee. It was a mistake for sure, but a relatively small one, since the bean business continued
So
well.
you sold beans, but you were not selling any liquid beverage.
Right, at Starbucks. And that was about, 75, I guess. When we started talking to Peet's about buying that company, we would start to go to those stores more often and said, these drinks, this feels pretty good. I like what it does to the store. So we started revamping Starbucks stores at that time, even though the question of whether we actually succeed in buying Peet's was an open question.
So, like you kind of alluded to this, the coffee industry, like many others, has faced crises such as like fluctuating prices. You mentioned the freeze in Brazil. There's like lots of environmental challenges. We had the pandemic recently. How or do you think the industry has built resilience, and where can it improve?
Wow.
Easy question.
Yeah. Build resilience. I don't think that there is very much resilience at the green end. Brian, you can correct me if you think otherwise, but growing coffee, well, like being a farmer in a lot of commodities, is difficult, subject to many things. Well, let's take Central American coffee. Not only is subject to weather, to climate change, to drought, to, let's talk about pests. There are so many nematodes loose in Central America that it's become very expensive to plant new trees, because you have to change the rootstock to something that is resistant to nematodes, which wine went through in several occasions, first in France and then in the U.S. When would that have been? Napa, I want to say, probably 70s, 80s, Napa alone spent about $1 billion replanting because of phylloxera, which is not exactly a nematode. I'll let a scientist correct me on that, but close enough. So anyway, back to resilience. So at the farming level, not resilient at all. At the selling end, I think there's quite a bit of resilience built in, because customers have gotten accustomed to this. And when it was once the case that if you wanted a cup of coffee, let's say when I was a kid, that you went to the diner or the pie store or the bakery or something like that and just, got a cup of coffee, put some cream in it, and on you go. But now it's flipped, so that you go to the coffee store and then see what pastries they have on offer. Mm-hmm. And it seems kind of silly to say that I believe I read that Starbucks has 11,000 of its own stores in the United States. That's a good, we have 200. And how many? And the business is really proliferating. The barrier to entry back to business students for opening a coffee store is quite low. Even roasting is not all that expensive, and so it's being done more and more. Some of these people actually figure out what they're doing. Others not are still working on it.
And so, like we mentioned resilience, but like I think a lot of our students are also really interested in the ethics of coffee as well. And so, like what would your advice be for students? If they want to be more conscious of their choices in a way that supports ethical practices in the industry, what would you recommend?
Wow. Did you warn me that one was coming?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yeah.
Because it touches a very it's an important subject to me. That I find situational ethics or to be disappointing. The definition, so when I started to become a business person alongside coffee, which has always been my main interest, I started to read, I'll call them the business philosophers. Renee McPherson, who was head of the Dana Corporation somewhere in the Midwest. I've forgotten his name, the guy who had Herman Miller furniture. But people who thought about what a company should be. And the definition should, let's see if I can do all five of them, but with your vendors, your staff, your customers, the community, you should be working for everyone's mutual benefit. And this, and that sort of thought precedes the Chicago School of Economics. And I blame it all on Milton Friedman. You can argue with me, but that a corporation exists to make money for the shareholders, I find extremely narrow, disappointing, maybe unethical, but it seems to me that not only is quality free, but ethics are too if you just pay attention. And so, why don't we share the burden with growers as we're doing? Coming back to TechnoServe, and ideas of, I'll say, true sustainability. There have been some sincere people who have started things like Equal Exchange, which was a part of Fair Trade and Flow. I met Paul Rice as he was getting Transfer USA started. But what happens to these? Well, Rainforest Alliance is another one. But as those become, what shall I say, successful or larger entities, then other considerations except those of the true believer enter the discussion. So at TechnoServe, for example, we had a client in Tanzania who had a one container, 37,000 pounds of coffee, that they wanted Fair Trade certified, and to ship to the United States. And Transfer only charged them $12,000 for that. Anything wrong with that math? So TechnoServe was successful in getting that money back, but just the fact that it happened is ridiculous. And in the case of Fair Trade, there's a 10-cent premium, at least it was in those days, that was supposed to go to the farmer, but it actually went back to the co-op. And sometimes it got to the farmer and sometimes it didn't. But we were talking about La Manita, which is a famous grower in Tarrazú, Costa Rica, who was not a co-op, so therefore not eligible for fair trade, despite the fact they had permanent housing for his permanent workers, who had electricity and bedrooms and a clinic for the doctor came through, dental care came through, there was a school there, but not eligible for fair trade because it wasn't a co-op. Okay, there's those of you who are interested in certification, I refer you to Veritas, who Peet uses as a certifier, which was started by two, I'll call them refugees from TechnoServe, gifted, smart coffee guys who are using new technology, cell phone, satellites, and motorbikes to actually visit the farms that are being certified. Whereas in prior times, I mean, I won't pick on anybody here, but some of these certifications, the farms were visited like every 5 years. And paper was filled out sitting in a pickup truck somewhere. And then the paper was sent in, and that was the certification. And it wasn't very reliable, let's say. Mm-hmm. And so, but part of it, I guess in a way that comes back to the coffee center and the use of technology. What the app you're working on to help select quality and understand what you're doing is a huge help, as well as the cell phone hooked to a satellite. So we actually know where you were. Mm-hmm. Were you on that farm? Did you certify it before you got on your motorcycle and took off? So I don't know. I went
that was
a few extra avenues.
That was fantastic. But you hit on kind of the next question, which was like emerging trends or technologies, and you just alluded to satellite imagery, and so that's in Veritas. So using that, what other new technologies or trends do you see coming down the pike?
Well, that actually is an interesting one. And in fact, what didn't that happen here is that satellite imagery can tell you a lot from, wine uses flyovers, not satellite, but you can tell a lot from just what color's the vineyard or what color's the coffee tree. And, but satellites are up there pretty high compared to drones. But so drones is one application of technology, but there's no substitute for walking in the field, walking in the coffee plantation. One of my favorite food writers was Angelo Pellegrini, who also taught English at the University of Washington. And but he would make wine every year, and he had a huge garden. And in one of his books talked about an Italian proverb that says the garden responds to the master's footsteps. And so the idea that you actually get in there and we'll say, talk to the vines or talk to the tomatoes or talk to the coffee, will tell you something. And where I'm going with that is something that David Browning, who was at TechnoServe at the time and who is the founder of Veritas, could do with rust in Central America, which those of you who know anything about coffee or have read anything, is a huge problem in Central America. It's a fungus, I think, on coffee leaves. And so if you don't have healthy leaves, you don't ripen the crop, whatever it is. But he found that by using just good husbandry, which some farmers didn't understand, is that the trees were healthier and the leaves, the yields were higher. And part of that, some of it is just pruning. the illustration of my first visit to Tanzania, I could not understand this coffee tree that was shaped this way, had leaves like those. It was early on. I said, man, is that a different kind of tree or what? No, it was a tree that the owner was afraid to prune because he would lose crop that year. So coffee trees are supposed to look like Christmas trees, so that the sun can come in and hit the fruit and ripen it. But that's one example of how difficult it is to farm is lack of knowledge at the farm level, among others.
So you already kind of hit my next question, which was like, what are the next big challenges the coffee world needs to address? And you mentioned rust. That's a big one. Are there other ones?
Well, boy, I mean, that's continuing, whether it's disease or insects. The big thing in East Africa was coffee berry disease. So as soon as it rains, you have to either spray, in those days with the SL variety, spray with copper sulfate, or forget about that crop. And that, sorry, I lost my...
Just big challenges. I'm giving you all the easy questions. Big challenges for the coffee industry.
Challenges, okay. Well, disease, especially with climate change, and insecticides, worker health. I mean, one of the things that just occurred to me, or I don't know, came across in something I was reading, is that a lot of people mistakenly think that organic means you didn't do anything. Well, those in agricultural school, you all know better than that. But are there endocrine disruptors in organic pesticides? I don't know the answer to that, but the health problems that exist in the population, a lot of them are related to food supply, either growing it or processing it.
Okay, I have one more question for you, but I'm going to save it to the very last, and I want to open it up for questions from the audience. So, if anybody has questions, I'll just ask you a question. I'm going to repeat it for the microphone. And so, here's your chance to ask co-founder of Starbucks and President Emeritus. Oh, we have a microphone. Oh, great. Oh, okay, cool. Oh my gosh, Laudia raised her hand first. Sorry.
Well, let me apologize for my voice and fogginess here with this cold, but I didn't get it on purpose.
Hi, what is the story behind the name Starbucks?
The real story?
Yes.
Well, the real story is that...
Oh, yeah, the question is...
Oh, sorry.
What was the origin of the name Starbucks? Where did the name Starbucks come from? And we do want the real story.
Okay, the real story is... this is very good, actually, since we just went through an election in San Francisco with ranked choice voting, which I think is a dumb idea, even if it does save money. We had a list of names, and we used ranked choice voting among the three of us. And we come up with a really dumb name that I'm not even going to say. But each of us then went to work in Alfred Peet's store while we were getting ready to open ours. And independently, each of us came back and said, no, we have to change the name. And it needs to be the surname. And ours were ridiculous. And if you put them together, you sound like a law firm. So we went to work on another list. And Starbucks was not on it, but Starbo was. And coincidentally, both of them are mining towns in eastern Washington. There's also a Starbucks, Minnesota, and heaven knows. And so when the word Starbucks came out of Gordon's mouth, we just said, that's it. And without identifying the fact, you can't mispronounce it, you can't misspell it. Everything's above the line graphically. It was perfect. And then I went to the library in the afternoon, which is my office, and then you could look in periodical guide to literature and things like that, reference books that probably no longer exist, but discovered that Mr. Starbuck, no first name, was the first mate on the Pequod and Moby Dick. That was cool. My son's name is Jason. Jason Starbuck was the rainmaker in a movie that was of that time. We said, done, here we go. And
So it came about just, you were just looking for cool words or names.
well,
that
we had
sounded
a
good.
big, long list of, all sorts of names. It is very hard to name things. When I started doing wine, I asked Gordon to help me out. Must have had 100 names on this thing, and they were all awful. And I talked to this guy who had worked for Procter & Gamble, who was running this big wine operation. He said, Jerry, name it after yourself. That's the only thing we can't do better than you.
Okay. So good question. So I think, yeah, you raised your hand in the red sweatshirt.
I have two questions. First one, what's your go-to coffee order right now?
What's your go-to coffee order?
Well, it depends on where I am, but it's either a double espresso or an espresso if it happens to be a place that uses a heavy-duty dosage.
All right, next question. Who did you look up to growing up as a young adult?
So question, who did you look up to growing up as a young adult? Who is your hero, I guess, or who are your...
Wow, I don't know. Probably some athlete, but I don't remember.
That's
a great question. I'll have to think about that one. I can't think of anyone. I probably would be respectful of writers and newspaper people. It was kind of it wasn't pre-television, but, well, it was for me, but television news anchors and stuff like that, they wouldn't be there. And popular culture was pretty narrow because there were so few places to get information. Newspaper and magazines were kind of it. But my neighbor had a Schwinn bicycle. It was really cool.
Good question. I want to make sure that people haven't had a chance with Jerry. So maybe the woman right here.
Hi. Okay. So I know a colleague that recently was sat on a flight transatlantic next to a high-level Starbucks executive, and he was making small talk with him and asked, how's the coffee market going? And that person, I guess, kind of laughed and said, Starbucks doesn't sell coffee, Starbucks sells milk. And I don't think he meant it as like an insult, because he was proceeded to talk about the milk market and kind of how much volume milk and alternative milks now make up in your business. And I just was wondering if you could speak to that, if you agree with that comment, and what your game is in the milk space, kind of, I guess.
Well, don't blame me, because I once proposed at Peet's that we give the cows a day off and only serve black coffee. It was not a popular idea. So those of you who have never had a cafe latte or don't order one now, please raise your hand. All right, well, good, thank you. But the difficult thing about being in retail is that you end up having to respond to customers' requests. It gave me a great deal of pleasure to observe Americans in Italy, and even as late as the end of the 80s, go into, I can recall one woman who insisted that she could go into a bar in Italy and order a latte. And of course, the guy said, hot or cold? She said, hot. That's what you got. Glass of warm milk. And now, at least in cities, they've adopted, oh, that's an American, I know what a latte is, Mm-hmm. They don't understand why you would drink it, because only kids do. In fact, in the early 80s, when espresso started to pick up and we're having machines manufactured, for the home, is that it took, 3 or 4 years to convince the manufacturers broadly not for commercial machines, but for home machines, is the question is, why do you need such a big boiler? Why do you need to isolate the boiler for coffee from the steamer? Because they had no idea how much milk Americans would drink with their coffee. You know, an Italian cappuccino would be in a roughly 5-ounce cup with a 7-gram shot of coffee, kind of unheard of, and a little bit of milk and foam, in a cup that's shaped like this, so that when you taste it, you get coffee, milk, foam, all in the same bite, and you get this tactile sensation on your tongue, and not in this straight-sided to-go cup, which separates everything. I mean, so if you order an espresso, how long does it take to drink an espresso? Answer, not long. You could get it in a porcelain cup in many places and enjoy it. That's my recommendation.
Great question. Yeah, right here.
Oh, yeah. So I want to ask, what do you think drove the initial success of Starbucks from the #1 store to, I guess, like the 10th store, the biggest factor in its initial success?
Well, I think that...
Let me repeat that question.
Yeah.
So, like, what was the biggest factor in Starbucks going from store #1 to store #10, like that early growth curve?
Well, I think that we did a few smart things. Alfred Peet was one. Good location was another. A good name. With Alfred Peet, of course, came some quality and perceptions of it. We didn't know what we were doing with coffee. So having him as a supplier gave us quality. I mean, we had to learn about freshness and aging and all the rest of it. But those three things, unquestionably.
Cool. I think it's at the top of the hour, so one more question. You've been very patient.
You
So,
mentioned earlier the zeitgeist, and I can think of no more epitome of a zeitgeist really than the espresso machine from Gaggia Milano. And when did that first arrive in the USA?
so the question is, when did the Gaggia espresso machine arrive in the U.S.? I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure. So, Milan was central for espresso machines for sure. The most famous one now, if you buy a prosumer machine for home.
Yes, but I'm really asking about a zeitgeist
Yeah.
story, not about the machine.
Okay.
But it's just the icon of the zeitgeist.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, the Carpiacs in Southern California, who owned a company that was variously known as ABC, America's Best Coffee, and a bunch of other things.
About a culture. When did it arrive?
When did espresso as a beverage arrive in the United States?
Well,
The whole culture of drinking.
Well, when
espresso.
it started to go, the Carpiacs, I think, started that in the 70s. Yes, because we were their Northwest representative in the 70s. But there were machines before. In North Beach in San Francisco, there were lots of espresso machines. No one actually knew what to do with them. There were a couple of Rossellini restaurants in Seattle. Italians, right? Oh, have an espresso after. The machine doesn't work.
So it was about 20 years later than in Europe, basically. Was it?
Oh, well, no, actually, it was going much earlier than that in Europe because, as I was about to say, the E61, which was the first pump-driven machine, which came from Weimar, which had a group head that circulated water back and forth in the tank. So it was hot, so the portafilter was hot, so you got a good espresso. That was 1961. But the lever machine was well ahead of that. That's the best I can do for that history.
So it's after the top of the hour, so I'm gonna have the privilege of asking the very last final question. Can you describe the best cup of coffee you ever had in your life? I thought it was a softball. Maybe it's a hard one. I'm not sure.
Well, I think, back to the professor I met this morning who's in this immersive sensory, the most, I'm going to answer one of the most memorable cups,
Okay.
okay? Because where you are, what you're doing, what the weather's like, the room you're in, who you're with, all of that changes your perception of the coffee. And my neighbor called me and said, Jerry, you got a flat tire. Oh, thanks a lot. So I guess I didn't have anything to do that day, but I made myself a press pot of Arabian mocha, a Yemen coffee, and I went up and changed the tire. It was a sunny spring day. It was beautiful. I think I drank the whole pot. But that was back when, you had spare tires in your trunk too. But that's one of the most.
Your best cup of coffee is when you're changing a flat tire. Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end it on. Jerry and I will hang out here for a few more minutes. There's more Aggie Blend and Aggie Bold in the back, so please enjoy that. And let's thank Jerry Baldwin for sharing his thoughts. Yeah.